get started. Can everyone hear the audio?
Yes.
Yep, and okay, excellent, great. So the live stream should be going. We're continuing to let people in from the waiting room. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all just very briefly. This is tonight's conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky and Professor Ilan Pappé. My name is Katie Natanel and I'm a lecturer in gender studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. I'm one of the organizers of the event, and I'm also a member of the European Center for Palestine Studies and the Exeter Decolonizing Network. This conversation series has actually emerged through the collaboration of all three of these communities, which has been just an incredible thing this year. I wanted to say a few words about the series and to tell you that it begins with the question of Palestine. Professor Ilan Pappé has very generously invited friends, colleagues, comrades, and collaborators to think and to talk with him and with all of us, really. And they touch open questions of justice and liberation and struggle and transformation in Palestine, which then touch open and intersect with some of the major issues and debates of our times. And it's just such a privilege to be able to be part of that discussion. So the project is one of sharing knowledge and experience, ideas, and also uncertainties in the interest of moving us toward new futures. So that's all I have to say about the series. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your patience tonight. And I will hand over to our chairs for the evening, Coulter Lewis and Sajjad Rizvi. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm one of your chairs for tonight. My name is Coulter Lowers. I'm a PhD candidate in Palestine Studies here at the University of Exeter. With me is my co-chair, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, who I will allow to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Sajjad Rizvi. I am an Associate Professor of Islamic Intellectual History at the Institute, and it's a pleasure, again, also to be moderating this conversation this evening. I'll say something about the ground rules in a second, if Coulter wants to say a few more words, and then we'll continue.
We have a few things to attend to before we start this conversation, because a lot of people deserve recognition for making tonight possible. Thank you to those who sponsored, hosted, and organized this event at the Institute for Arab and Islamic Studies here at Exeter, as well as the European Center for Palestine Studies and the Exeter Decolonizing Network. And thank you as well to the amazing team behind this event, Andrea Wallace, Neha Shaji, Asha Ali, Finlay Carroll, Riyad Gaymore, Sarah Wood, Sarah Roberts, Nadia Khalaf, Gareth Stansfield, and the university events team. And of course, a massive thanks to you, Katie, who has put an immense amount of work in behind the scenes to make this night possible. And thank you as well to our truly global audience who booked this event full on Zoom within 24 hours of it going up on Eventbrite. And thank you finally to my co-chair, Sajjad, and thank you to our speakers, Exeter's own Ilan Pappé and the University of Arizona's Professor Noam Chomsky. We've invited Professors Pappé and Chomsky to discuss the present political and social impasse, as well as the potential for future internationalism and radical change. For many of us, the outlook appears bleak in 2021, from the stark inequalities exposed by the pandemic to the situation in Palestine, where, in a world with so much flux and change, a century of Israeli colonization grinds on, unabated in that tortured land. At the present moment, moreover, Palestine's international solidarity movement in the UK, America, and elsewhere is subjected to renewed efforts to silence criticism of Israel. What then should we do? Where, historically, have dissidents found hope and made progress, and what avenues are yet to be traversed? What tools are available to social movements, activists, and academics to create a better future in Palestine and beyond? We look forward to Professor Chomsky's and Professor Pappé's reflections on all of this, and more in the coming hour. After some brief introductions, we'll have the conversation between Professor Chomsky and Pappé. After about 45 minutes, we'll open up the room to questions from our viewers, both on Zoom and YouTube, and then we'll close about a half hour after that. There's a hashtag for the event if you're planning to share on social media. It is hashtag ChomskyPappé 2021. Professor Rizvi will now lay out the ground rules for conduct and explain how to participate in that Q&A session.
Thanks, Coulter. Just a few simple things. Obviously, please do keep yourself muted through the event. When it comes to the Q&A session, you can, of course, send in your comments and questions using the chat function on Zoom and also on YouTube, and we will moderate that. Please make sure that you use, well, if you want your name to be anonymous, you can, of course, anonymize yourself once you're in the Zoom room. Just be aware that we will use whatever the screen name comes up as the questioner. Colt has already mentioned the hashtag, and I don't think there's really much else to say except for that we're all very much looking forward to this conversation. So let me, I guess, begin with the introductions of our two speakers. In many ways, they don't need much introduction. I'm sure everyone who is listening to this is perfectly aware of who Ilan Pappé and Noam Chomsky are. But still, we should do our due diligence. And of course, this will be a record. It will be on our YouTube stream, and it will remain on our YouTube channel for the forthcoming future. So let me just say a few things about Ilan Pappé, our colleague at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. Ilan is a professor of history and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies, an expatriate Israeli historian, although of course at the moment he is very much in Israel, and a socialist activist. He's one of the new historians who came to prominence on the study of Israel, Palestine in the 80s. I remember, for example, a wonderful, perhaps one of the most exciting seminar series I took part in as a grad student was on the new Israeli history. And in that, I had the privilege actually of presenting Ilan's dissertation, his first book, as part of that conversation. His research contextualizes the history of Palestine in a larger global context of settler colonialism and challenges the dominant Israeli narrative, which in many ways he's been doing since that time. In addition to his work with the Exeter, the European Center for Palestine Studies, he chairs the Emil Tuma Institute for Palestine Studies in Haifa, and is a founding member of the new movement, the One Democratic State Initiative. He's, of course, the author of numerous works, including the best-selling The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and most recently his 2016 book, The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of the Occupied Territories, received the Palestine Book Award. Salient also, of course, to the conversation today is the two works that he wrote with Professor Chomsky, one being Gaza in Crisis and the other one on Palestine. So with that, I'll pass over to Coulter, who will say a few things about Professor Chomsky.
As Sajid said correctly, it's often said that Noam Chomsky needs no introduction. Most, if not all of you, are surely familiar with his reputation. The breadth and depth of his work is extraordinary. Apart from his groundbreaking work in the field of linguistics, his meticulous political writings cover the realm of American imperialism, media criticism, and the Israel-Palestine conflict, amongst other things. Amongst those works are the two books he co-authored with Ilan, On Palestine and Gaza in Crisis. Few people are endowed with Chomsky's formidable faculties, and fewer still direct them so fully in the service of justice and the end of human suffering. Despite a reputation as the most important intellectual alive, Chomsky has chosen not to build an intellectual monument to himself. Rather, he has devoted himself to the task of resolving the most pressing political problems of our age. His unwavering commitment to disengaging truth from the skein of lies the powerful have concocted to conceal it has inspired and informed the work of untold numbers of young activists and scholars, present company included. Fellow listeners, I give you Noam Chomsky in conversation with Ilan Pappé.
Great. Thank you. Again, apologies for everyone for some technical issues, which shows us that we are all longing for normal human interaction with other human beings. Zoom has its failure. Noam, it's wonderful to see you again and to talk to you. And thank you again for taking the time. I know how busy you are, and we really, really appreciate it. And thank you, the team that was helping preparing this meeting and making it possible. Since we have already lost some time, I will just give a general thank you for everyone. Although I prepared a long list by name, alphabetic name, but I think we'll skip it. Believe me, I thank every one of you from my heart. Okay, Noam, so we can start. In 1967, you wrote an article on the responsibility of the intellectual, a piece of work that really influenced my life. Not immediately. I was 12 years old when the article appeared, so it happened a bit later. In 2019, a conference in UCL in London, wishing to discuss this article about the responsibility of the intellectual, was censored, which shows that your article is still regarded as dangerous and subversive to the powers that be. It is indeed one of the many topics you were engaged with over the years, the responsibility of intellectuals. This continued censorship on your article, more than 50 years later, 53 years later, in fact, raises the question whether much has changed since. Is it possible that the new generation of intellectuals, of scholars maturing into the 21st century still shun that responsibility? And if I may add to this before you respond, Noam, and in this concern, to look beyond Britain to the USA and ask you whether anything has changed in your view in that part of the world, given the bleak view you used to have at the time and after 67 on the complicity of American intellectuals in the criminal American policies dating back to Southeast Asia in the early 1960s up to the present American involvement in the continued oppression of the Palestinians today. Has anything changed in Americans' intellectual sense of responsibility or even in their readiness to assume accountability for what is done overseas in their name, quite often with their intellectual support, and as citizens of America, also with their money in a way, as taxpayers? Are we in a better position today when it comes to the courage and commitment of intellectuals?
Well, let me start by just making a comment which few people know about the article you referred to, 1967. Actually, it appeared in 1966 in a place which would surprise you, the Journal of the Hillel Foundation at Harvard University. And that's a very significant fact. In 1966, I was giving a talk to the Hillel Foundation. They published it in their journal, Mosaic. Since 1967, that would have been impossible. And that explains some of the ways that things change. In 1966, it was still possible to talk about Israel-Palestine in the United States. From 1967, it became virtually impossible. Anyone who tried to mention it was a pariah. You may recall a couple of years later, 1972, Abba Eban, who you all know, foreign minister at the time, very respected, had an article in the liberal Zionist journal, the Congress Weekly, American Jewish Congress. The article informed American Jews of what their responsibility was. Their responsibility was to show that there is no difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And anti-Zionism meant criticism of his government, the Labor government in Israel. And he gave two examples to show how dangerous this anti-Zionism was. He was talking about what he called Jewish self-hatred. And he gave two examples of Jewish self-hatred. I was one, Izzy Stone, I.F. Stone was the other. Dedicated Zionist, but critical of the government of Israel's policies. So he says, on the one hand, there are non-Jews who are anti-Semites. On the other hand, there are Jews who are consumed with a neurotic Jewish self-hatred. So that covers the spectrum. Anyone critical of the government of Israel is an anti-Semite. It's your duty to show it, Jewish community. You have recently heard that in in England very prominently, same message, the way of destroying Jeremy Corbyn and a progressive Labour Party by showing that anyone critical of Israel is an anti-Semite. They don't put it in those words, but it's what it amounts to. Well, how much have things changed? Somewhat. So, for example, until a kind of a bellwether of American intellectual opinion is the New York Review of Books. It's the major journal of sort of liberal, left liberal American intellectuals. Up until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, this regime held. It was impossible to discuss the issue. I used to write for the New York Review regularly, but not after I became involved publicly in Israel-Palestine issues. After that, anathema, couldn't possibly. It has changed in the last year or two, strikingly. So if you read the journal now, you can read highly critical articles of Israeli policy, typically by Israeli writers. That makes it sort of tolerable. Strong article by Nathan Thrall, very, very strong article, appeared in a recent issue. All of this reflects changes in public opinion in the United States. And those ultimately reflect themselves in intellectual opinion and maybe someday in policy. That's a matter of some significance. But as Israeli policies became more and more brutal, reactionary, intolerable, what happened is that general liberal opinion, people who identify themselves as liberal Democrats, has shifted away from the almost Stalinist style support for Israel that used to exist, just reflexive, couldn't say a word. It's shifted to actually by now more support for Palestinian rights than for Israel. And it's showing up in the intellectual journals. It's showing up, not yet, but it may show up in policy. So support for Israel now in the United States used to be, Israel used to be the liberal darling. Couldn't say a word about it. It wasn't just not being able to write. Meetings were broken up. I had to have police protection if I tried to talk about the topic, even in my own university. That's all changed. Now it's quite possible in these circles to be very critical of Israel. Support for Israel has shifted to the evangelical community, which is a huge community in the United States, and to ultra-right nationalists, military and security committed, and so on and so forth. Now that does leave opportunities also for change in the policies. We haven't seen it yet, but this has a way of affecting things. So I think with regard to intellectuals, yes, there has been a change largely caused by Israel's violence and brutality. I give talks on this constantly, and you could see exactly when it turned. So Cast Lead, for example, the 2006 Israeli invasion of Lebanon had a big effect. Before that, I was still getting police protection. After that, I was getting big crowds, same talks. Changed quite a lot. And the more Israel moves to the right, the more brutal and harsh its policies get, the harder they are to suppress, the more you're seeing changes in attitudes, also among intellectuals. And to a limited extent in the press, not very much, but some. Well, that's the way things change. That's how what's happened. Activism on the ground has a way of shifting attitudes, shifting what's sometimes called the Overton window, the range of things that you're permitted to talk about within the mainstream framework, where you can push a little at the edges. And this could, sooner or later, have an effect on policy if the proper activities are undertaken. So I think it's a very significant issue, not much discussed, but very worth looking at quite closely. Actually, my friend Norman Finkelstein has a book about this, came out a couple of years ago. I think you're muted. Can't hear.
Yeah, now you can hear me. Sorry. Yes, say that in many ways I would share your optimism. Although in this country, in the United Kingdom, of course, and maybe because it's much more prevalent now to speak openly about Palestine, there are countermeasures taken by people from above and by local lobbies. So the Prevent program, which you are familiar with, I'm sure, is also targeting any events that deal with criticism on Israel. Recently, we have been exposed to a different kind of assault of freedom of speech when it comes to Israel and Palestine through the new definitions of the Holocaust denial, where criticism of Israel is equated with anti-Semitism, and denial of the Holocaust. Just recently, the Secretary of State for Higher Education considered withdrawing funding for universities if the definition of the International Holocaust Remember Alliance for Holocaust denial would not be endorsed, a definition that, as I mentioned before, really equates criticism on Israel with Holocaust denial. So maybe this is a measure of success, the fact that there are also still, at least in the UK, some assaults on this question. But if I may sort of take it to a different angle of this debate, because we are in a better position now to talk in the academia about Israel and Palestine, and probably, as you say, there's some influence on the media, but I'll come back to the media later on. There is a different angle to this question when we are struggling with policies such as Prevent in the UK, or the definitions of the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remember Alliance, that tries to stifle discussion on Palestine. Our students, in a recent debate on the IHRA issue, which we had in the Institute, raised concern that echoed concern that I know you had at the time on the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the BDS movement, and you raised it among other places in our joint book on Palestine. On the one hand, there is a wish to continue and struggle in this country, also I suppose in the United States, against any attempt to silence criticism of Israel that is done usually by weaponizing anti-Semitism as a principal tool of intimidation. On the other hand, there is a worry that freedom of speech, rather than the plight of the Palestinians, becomes the main focus of the solidarity movement. How can we balance both legitimate concern, indeed without forgetting the primary motivation for solidarity? Because quite a lot of people sort of feel that one stress comes at the expense of the other. And I know that this is some of the criticism that you had at the time, or worries rather, it was not criticism, I think it was more concern, where focus on freedom of speech rather than the topic that the freedom of speech is supposed to serve would kind of divert the attention from the real issues at hand.
Well, it's a constant. I think the increase in the intensity of efforts to silence discussion on this topic recently in the United Kingdom. I think that's a sign of the increased desperation of supporters of Israeli policy as they see the control of opinion slipping out of their hands. They're resorting to harsher and more desperate measures to try to block any discussion, any condemnation. So in a way, it's sort of a good sign to see the attempts to extremism of the attempts to silence discussion means situations getting out of their control. It used to be much easier in England. So just to remind you of an event back in the 80s, which I'm sure you remember, late 80s, I think, or maybe 90s, don't remember exactly when. There's a journal, Index on Censorship, which is concerned with issues of freedom of expression and so on. It had been focused about 100% on Eastern Europe, on the attempts in Eastern Europe to silence dissidents and so on. The editor of the journal, who himself was an Eastern European dissident, decided that it would be interesting to try to shift it, to open the discussion to another area, actually an area that George Orwell wrote about, suppression of thought in free societies. I should mention that Orwell's essay on this was suppressed. It's the introduction to Animal Farm, which was suppressed, came out 30 years later. It was about how in free England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. Now, theoretically, it's available. Well, the editor of Index wanted to do the same thing, open up Index on Censorship just for one article on how ideas are suppressed within free societies. So he invited me, and I wrote an article on how discussion of Israel-Palestine is suppressed in the United States without the use of force, just by other means. The roof fell in. He had to retire. The journal was closed. Huge attack on the journal for allowing this to happen. Turned out later that it was initiated by a leading exponent of freedom of speech and a person who was in fact an old friend, Isaiah Berlin. Behind the scenes was orchestrating this attack, was denied, all sorts of things, but it became very clear. Well, the journal was reconstituted. I don't think it has gone in this dangerous direction, at least in the years that followed. That was then. You could just silence things. Now it's not so easy. It's harder, and therefore the effort to follow Abba Evan's advice from 50 years ago and to tar any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, that's intensifying. The idea is picking up. You've seen a lot of it in England. I don't have to report it. But I think it's all a reflection of the fact that indeed Israeli policies are becoming increasingly difficult to defend. And it's necessary to resort to means of suppression of opinion, if possible, shifting the topic to anti-Semitism, to something else, in order to marginalize it. I should say that segments of the left very mistakenly are joining in on this, not on this issue, but on other things. What's called cancel culture is an effort by students, some others, to try to prevent the kind of talk that they don't want to hear. It's wrong in principle, and it's tactically idiotic. It's a gift to the right wing. They love it. And it, of course, what it means is those who have the power will use it for their interests. So yes, all these problems arise all the time. And what you have to do is keep your eyes on the main issues. The main problem is not academic freedom in Britain and the United States, it's the plight of the Palestinians. Anything that diverts attention to that, from that, and from what's going on and what we can do about it, anything that diverts attention from that is completely wrong. We have to focus on that and what can be done. And there is, in fact, a lot that can be done, including things that are not discussed, possibly because they're so important. When something is not discussed and is very topical, you should be concerned. So there is something that on the surface doesn't seem to be related to Israel-Palestine, but in fact is very closely related, and that's Iran. Right now, front pages, constant talk, great threat of Iranian nuclear weapons programs, supposed programs. Got to do something about it. Big negotiations in Vienna. Actually, there's something very simple to do about it, which everyone knows and thinks about these things, but nobody's allowed to talk about, and it has to do with Israel. A very simple way to solve the problem, alleged problem, of Iranian nuclear weapons is to institute a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That would resolve the problems, reduce tensions, have enormous positive effects. Why isn't it done? Iran is strongly in favor of it. The Arab states have been strongly in favor of it for 30 years. There's the ones who instituted it, including Egypt. Global South overwhelmingly in support of it. No criticism from Europe, they'd go along with it. It's blocked because the United States vetoes it, most recently Obama, and the United States vetoes it because it does not want Israeli nuclear weapons to be open to inspection. In fact, the United States does not acknowledge their existence, though it's not in doubt. And the reason is that American law would come into play and raise the question whether any US aid to Israel is even legal under US law. Well, it's an important point that could be pushed by an activist group. Bring to the American population, similar things in England, the fact that we're facing serious threats of war, danger, in order to preserve the huge flow of military and economic aid to Israel and to Egypt, incidentally, to the Egyptian dictatorship, which is connected with this. These are things which have a lot of resonance among American population, could lead to raising very serious questions about the nature of US support for Israel, and even a hint of withdrawing any of that support would have a big impact on Israel's policies. Israel is very dependent on the United States for support, has been ever since the 1970s, when Israel adopted a very clear policy of choosing expansion over security, meaning reliance on the United States for protection. It's a very fragile system. Well, these are things that could be done right away, could have a big effect. There are others that you can think of. So yes, there are possible actions within our reach, which would have a major effect on global politics, and in particular on Israel-Palestine rights. Necessary to think about them. They're not presented to you every day in the newspapers, obviously. You have to think them through and see what the interconnections are. And there are many.
Yes, I think I totally agree. I think, but part of the reason, I think, although I am as optimistic as you are about changes in the media, reading even the more respectable American media outlets, and also in Britain, and being also a fellow in an Institute for Arab and Islamic Studies with colleagues who are experts on the history and present realities in the Arab world and in the Muslim world, there still is a sense that even the best of the media provides a very superficial, sometimes even I would say malicious, framing of the Arab world. For instance, this idea that sectarianism has been there in time immemorial in the Arab world, and therefore there's no hope for any reasonable, rational solution, or that religion in the Middle East always is a fanatic religion. And those of us who are studying the history in the present reality are always worried how distorted and how destructive these images are. But I think you're right. Today, there are, first of all, alternative media outlets that emerge in this age of internet that allow people a different access to information and analysis. Let's hope that the virtual developments will be as effective as were developments of social movements before the age of internet on the ground, thinking about the mass movement against the war in Vietnam, or the movement for civil rights in the United States. So in this in mind, I would like to move away a little bit from Palestine and ask you a little bit, how do you see the impact of social movements in the United States? Let's take one, what seems to be for the time being a successful social movement, the Black Lives Matters. And on the other hand, the ones that maybe so far, the jury is not still out on that, but so far has not been too successful, like Occupy Wall Street. How do you view the future of these social movements? And if I may add to this, how do you view the special circumstances in which we live now due to the COVID-19 pandemic? Some people optimistically think that inadvertently it opened new vistas and opportunities for creating a counter-alliance of internationalism and solidarity that challenges the neoliberal and neo-capitalist interpretation and praxis of internationalism based on narrow economic interest and projects of privatization, and perpetuates social and economic marginalization of non-white and non-elite groups in society. Is there a new hope out of the pandemic for counter-internationalism? Can it take place only in the virtual world? How far should it take place on the ground itself, as it did before the age of internet? Are you hopeful that these kinds of mass movements can still in the future have the impact on policies from above? And it doesn't matter whether we are talking about domestic policies in America or American foreign policy or other countries' foreign policies in the rest of the world.
Well, let's take a look at those movements that you mentioned. Best way to think about those kinds of questions, I think, at least, is very concretely what has been done, what can be done. Now take Occupy. It's widely said that the Occupy movement failed. I was very much involved in it. I don't think it failed. I think it was a big success. Remember that Occupy was not a strategy. It was a tactic. It was a short-term tactic. You can't occupy Scotty Park forever. You can do it for a couple of months. During the brief period of the Occupy tactic, it broke open the issue of radical inequality, which had been suppressed. It became a major issue. It became one of the things that other movements focused on, policy began to focus on, and so on. That's a breakthrough. It's an achievement. More was hoped for. There were activists in Occupy were hoping to move into neighborhoods, carry out neighborhood organizing on similar issues. Well, succeeded to some extent, not as much as what was hoped. That's the way movements work. Take Black Lives Matter. that's been enormously successful. Even before the George Floyd murder, Black Lives Matter had penetrated large parts, not only of the Black community, but others, and was remarkably popular, had general popularity way beyond what social movements have. After the Floyd assassination, it just exploded. There were massive demonstrations all over, solidarity, Blacks and whites together, overwhelmingly peaceful demonstrations, probably 98%, a little bit of property destruction around the fringes. Of course, that was what was focused on by the right-wing media. It had literally 2/3 popular support in the United States. That is incredible for a popular movement. It's far beyond what Martin Luther King had, even at the peak of his popularity, and it remains very high. Of course, the right wing is making extreme efforts to try to demonize the movement, saying it was all about violence, it was trying to murder whites, and so on and so forth. See that all over. Just about every Republican state now, right now, is either considering or passing legislation to effectively ban popular demonstrations. So, for example, the state of Oklahoma just made it legitimate for the driver of a car to hit, even to kill demonstrators if some fake pretense. In other words, you should really look at these legislations. They're desperation across the board to try to stop any popular activism. This goes along with the parallel efforts in Republican states to prevent voting, to cut back the danger that there might be popular votes. That's desperation. And unfortunately, there is support for it. Trump was brilliant at tapping the poisons that run just beneath the surface in American society, bringing them to the surface, giving them some kind of justification, at least self-justification, and it's leading to a very serious problem. It's almost half the population, which is now consumed with terror about what's called the Great Replacement. The white traditional Christian population is being overwhelmed and destroyed, faced with genocide by immigrants, Blacks, and so on and so forth. I'm old enough to remember this in the 1930s. It's not funny. That's happening. Well, but that's part of that is the reaction to the growth of successful popular movements, which are having a major impact. The Sanders campaign was an astonishing success. It broke with over a century of American political history. American elections are pretty much bought by concentrations of economic power. You can predict the outcome of an election with remarkable high probability simply by looking at campaign spending. That Sanders totally changed that, became the most popular political figure in the country, virtually won nomination with no support from any wealth and power. The same kind of attacks that you saw in the British media against Corbyn, either ignoring or denunciation or lies, but he broke through. Now the head of one of the most important committees in the Senate, the Budget Committee, with major influence. Others came in on the Sanders wave. The movements are increasing. All of this can continue to happen. Now, what about the effect of the pandemic? It's very interesting to look at it closely. tells you a lot about our culture and our level of civilization. The question is, the COVID epidemic, of course, is international, like global warming, like other major property crises. There's no boundaries. They're everywhere. It's obvious in the case of COVID. And it's very striking to see what's happening. It's understood across the board by everyone that unless vaccines go quickly to the poor areas, to Africa, to Asia, to those regions, unless that happens, the virus is going to mutate. It's already mutating. It's going to lead to new variants. Some of them may be extremely lethal, like Ebola. Some may be uncontrollable. It'll come back and hit the rich. It'll devastate them. That's known. So what are the rich countries doing about it? Preventing vaccines from going to the poor areas. Take a look through the array of rich countries. They're monopolizing vaccines, even well beyond what they can use, just storing them up just in case, not distributing them to the poor countries, even though the leadership knows very well that it's a suicidal course. It's more important, if you're the leader of a rich country, to guarantee the profits of big pharmaceutical corporations, their what are called intellectual property rights, than to save yourself from destruction, let alone the ethical issue of how many Africans and Asians you're going to kill. It's amazing to watch. Tells you something about the level of civilization in the highest circles, okay? The details are even more astonishing. So actually there are a few countries who are internationalist, one in particular, Cuba. It's the one genuinely internationalist country in the world. Sends out doctors all over, sends out, like when at the beginning of the, a year ago, beginning of the pandemic in Europe, you'll recall, there was a real outbreak in northern Italy, very serious outbreak. Northern Italy happens to be very close to two rich countries, which are in the same union, technically, European Union that Italy is, Germany and Austria. They, at that point, had the pandemic pretty well under control. Very rich countries, lots of resources. Did they send any help to Northern Italy? Go take a look. No, they're not interested. Somebody did. Cuba. Cuba was willing to send lots of doctors to Northern Italy to help out during the pandemic. Right now, a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services deals with all these issues, issued its 2020 report, the last report under the Trump administration, full of self-congratulation, of course. If you read it closely, there's a very interesting paragraph buried inside it. It said how the United States is reacting to the COVID epidemic in South America, which is very severe. In Panama, severe COVID epidemic, they congratulate themselves on having pressured the government of Panama to refuse to remove from the country the Cuban doctors who had come to assist, because we have to stop Cuba's malign influence in the Western Hemisphere. Brazil is a total disaster area. You can read that in the headlines. They don't have vaccines. The United States, they praise themselves for having convinced the government of Brazil not to accept Russian vaccines that were offered, which are exactly the same as Western vaccines. But we have to stop that malign influence. And that's happening worldwide. There are pressures for a people's vaccine, which will break the monopolies. A lot of the pressures coming from countries like Cuba, China, they claim they'll provide free vaccines. Whether they'll do it or not, I don't know. The rich and powerful are refusing. The United States has an excess of vaccines that it can't use. The reason is there has yet been no authorization for the use of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. So it's all piling up in warehouses. Well, President Biden graciously decided to release some of it to other countries. Which ones? Canada, which is the world champion in storing vaccines that it can't use, just has them piled up way beyond it can use. So let's give it to Canada. How about Asia, Africa, please? Second country that got it is Mexico, as part of a bribe to get Mexico to prevent desperate refugees from fleeing to the American border. That's called generosity in terms of Western civilization, and it's beyond what the European countries are doing. So what are the prospects for internationalism? Not from leadership, maybe on the ground. There can be popular movements moving towards genuine internationalism on all fronts, whether it's Palestinian rights, Abraham Accords, which somebody mentioned, saving ourselves from destruction from the next pandemic, overcoming the desperate crisis of environmental destruction, can be done. It's not going to come from leadership. Can come from popular activist pressures, the way everything's happened in the past. So I think that's what we have to look at.
No, my last question, because I know that many people want to ask you, and I will let them ask. And this actually ties in with your final remark on where should we hope for a change, not coming from the elite, but rather from social movements who share international solidarity, share international agendas that eventually can influence, of course, local struggles like the one in Palestine for freedom and liberation. This really is kind of a question for our student community, either those who work on decolonization or those who work on Palestine or people who work on other parts of the world. I think that many of them would ask themselves about the utility of believing that one can change politics from above in their own personal careers, or changing politics from within rather than from above? Or should they hope and maybe even cherish the prospect of being part of grassroots movements of revolution, involved in radical action from below, so to speak, and by that contribute to a more just society? Can, for instance, what you termed many years ago as the corporatocracy be at all reformed from within, or can it only be challenged from the outside? This is a question of a career pattern for our graduates whose healthy instincts against injustice hopefully will stay with them as long as possible. But I think they would be very happy to hear your general view on it when they, especially for our younger members of the community, when they leave university and decide what should be their role and place in the world. And this would be my last question before we open it up to the audience.
Well, the official line, which of course one should always view with considerable skepticism, is that changes come from leadership. Enlightened leadership views the situation realistically. The intelligent men of the community, men, of course, think things through and decide what's right, and then they make decisions to the benefit of all. And that's what you learn in school, that's what you read in the newspapers and so on. there's an element of truth to it. When legislation is passed, it's passed in Congress or Parliament. When decisions are made in corporate boardrooms, they're made in corporate boardrooms. But why are they made? Why some decisions and not others? Here we go back to the popular forces that are changing the circumstances, the conditions under which decisions are made. So if you leave it to corporate boardrooms, they'll use fossil fuels to the maximum. Doesn't matter if it destroys the world. Who cares? We'll make more profit tomorrow. It's the nature of the institution. You go to the top banks, they'll invest in fossil fuels because they can make money that way. Okay, they know the consequences, but doesn't fit within the institutional framework. Same is true of legislatures. On the other hand, if the corporate boardrooms look out the window and see what they describe as, in their terms, the peasants coming with the pitchforks, in polite terms, it's called reputational risks, meaning we're in trouble. Then you'll get something that we see over and over. Groups of leading CEOs, major business groups saying, addressing the public and saying, yes, we realize we've made mistakes, but now we're going to overcome them. We're going to become what used to be called soulful corporations who are going to work for the benefit of the common good. So trust us and go home. And they'll actually do something, which is not meaningless. You can press them to do things that are worth doing, like maybe getting the banks to cut back investment in fossil fuels. On the other hand, if you look closely when, say, ExxonMobil says, okay, we realize we did something wrong, we have to work on renewable energy, and take a look at the details. You know, they're putting money into sustainable energy. How? Carbon capture, that is, technologies which will allow them to continue to use fossil fuels to the maximum, because maybe somehow somebody will figure out a way to get the poison out of the air after we put it in. Those are the things you'd be looking for. Same in the political system. There are people in the political system who genuinely want significant change. In the United States, we just saw it 2 days ago. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the young representatives, came in on the Sanders wave. She and Ed Markey, senior senator from Massachusetts, has been interested in the environment all his career. The two of them just instituted legislation on a Green New Deal, which is exactly what has to be done. Detailed, feasible, worked out as to how it would work, better life, better jobs, overcome the climate crisis. Okay, it's now on the legislative agenda. That's as a result of a great deal of activism on the part of mostly young people, like Extinction Rebellion in the United States, Sunrise Movement in England, Sunrise Movement in the United States, and so on. That's how things change, okay? So yes, decisions are made in the Senate, in Parliament, in the corporate boardrooms, but under circumstances and conditions which are established to a significant extent by popular action and activism and demands. There's that interaction is there, it's always been there, will continue to be. So it's not one or the other, but both.
Yes, and I'm thinking about Betty McCollum, I think, who initiated legislation about abuse of children's rights in the occupied territories as part of a new condition for American support and so on. So definitely there is a positive energy also for some of the younger generation in the House of Representatives. Thank you very much, Noam, for this part. I can already see fantastic questions in the chat box, so I hope you can still be with us for a short while, and we'll take some of the questions and answer. Is that okay?
It's okay, but I have to tell you that I have a 12 o'clock talk in Brazil. That's the way it works these days.
That's the way of the world.
Leave.
We'll make sure that at least you have, if we give you 5 minutes before that, is that okay, or you want 10 minutes before that?
12 o'clock my time, 7 o'clock.
Yeah, so should we finish at 12 o'clock your time? Or before?
A little before.
I know.
A little bit before. Okay, so we'll finish about 6 to 7 minutes before. Is that okay?
Yes, that'll work. Just about.
That will work. Fantastic. We'll make sure about that. I'm sure the organizers heard it. So make sure that we wrap up at about 10 to 7 to the hour, and we release Professor Chomsky for his third assignment today. Okay, and this is just the morning, I think, in Arizona. So here we are. Who is it, Coulter or Sajjad to take over?
I'll start things off. Thank you to both of you for that wonderful set of exchanges. There are lots of questions to come in, and we'll try and deal with as many as we can in the short period of time. Let me kick it off with one question, which is to both of you, from our colleague Mustafa Beg, which is, have the Abraham Accords ended any little remaining hope of Palestinian statehood? And what might these accords mean for the future of the Middle East?
Should I start or you
Yes,
start?
please start, Noam.
Well, the Abraham Accords, which have been greatly hailed in the West as a major step forward, are in effect bringing to the surface arrangements that had long existed tacitly among the most reactionary states in the region. The Gulf dictatorships, Sisi's Egypt, the most brutal dictatorship in Egypt's ugly history. Trump's favorite dictator, as he called him, 60,000 political prisoners in jail. The Gulf dictatorships, I don't have to talk about it, you know about that. Their tacit relations with Israel have now been brought to the surface and formalized. Israel itself has moved so far to the right that it fits in very well with the alliance of reactionary states. So this is from the point of view of the United States, which pretty much orchestrated it. It's part of the geostrategic program of the Trump administration, not that different from its predecessors, to create an international alliance of the world's most reactionary states, headed in Washington. The Middle East sector is the Abraham Accords, brings in people like Modi in India, destroying Indian secular democracy, crushing Muslim rights, destroying Kashmir, so a perfect candidate. Bolsonaro in Brazil, where I'm going to be talking in 20 minutes, denouncing their government. That's a Trump clone, basically, so that's a member. So put all this together as, and part of it is, in the Middle East part, is organized so as to combat what's called the threat of Iran. The main threat of Iran is it doesn't subordinate itself to this system. It's a deterrent. Ugly regime, but not the only ugly regime in the neighborhood by any means. That's not the reason. So that's basically what the Abraham Accords are. Of course, it kicks the Palestinians in the face, kicks the Kurds in the face. Anybody who's weak and defenseless gets kicked in the face, and power systems, that's their nature. But it's by no means the end of the road. There are a lot of options available. I've mentioned some, there's plenty more.
Yeah, I would just add to this, Mustafa, that it's important to remember that the Arab regimes do not represent, I think, in most cases, what their societies would have liked the government's policies towards Israel to be. And it didn't start with the Abraham Accord. It goes back to the so-called peace between Israel and Egypt in the late 1970s, through the peace with Jordan in 1994. You cannot overcome the problem of having an alien a rogue state in the middle of the Middle East by just having strategic alliances with authoritarian elites. If Israel is really seeking reconciliation with the Middle East, it will have to seek reconciliation with the people of the Middle East, not the governments of the Middle East. And that reconciliation will only go through a just solution for the Palestine question. Thank you.
Okay. We have a second question for Professor Chomsky, though given the nature of the question, I think it's fair if Professor Pappé also gives us his thoughts. It says, from Attila via Zoom, as a Palestinian, I think that the current Palestinian political strata and other centers of power within the Palestinian society are hindering many moves towards more freedoms on the social and political levels. This in turn weakens the whole society and its ability to stand against the occupation and its arms. How should we challenge that from within Palestinian society?
Well, that's for Palestinians to answer. I don't have answers to Palestinians about what they ought to do. I have my opinions, but no particular reason why they should pay attention to them. They know better than I do. I mean, there's some things that are obvious, like the Hamas-Fatah conflict has to be resolved. Every time they've tried to resolve it, Israel's intervened to try to prevent it. They don't want it resolved. There are other conflicts that have to be resolved, but I would just throw this question to where it belongs, into the lap of the Palestinians.
I agree. Let's move to the next question.
Coulter, do you want to do the Kamal's question as well?
Okay, sure. This one's from Kanwal Hamid from Zoom as well, to both. Thinking about your comment about how extremely right-wing Israel has become, I wonder what is the limit of the left in the context of a colonial state? Can you really conceive of a future in which decades of Palestinian resistance achieve their goals of liberation and return of refugees while the structures of the settler colony continue to exist, even in a different way?
No.
You want to go, Ilan?
Okay, I will start. I do think that there is very little hope in the near future for any change from within Israel. I don't think this is the one thing that will bring in the first place any change in the reality of Israel and Palestine. This is why I strongly believe in pressuring Israel, and I do support the BDS movement despite the constructive criticism we had from Professor Chomsky on this. And I think that definitely the left still has a role to play in organization, in building grassroots movements that eventually could create a joint agenda for the liberation of Palestine. So in this respect, I think that this is not so much a matter for change from within, although everybody has his or her role to play. I still would like to see a unity on the Palestinian side, a change in the international community's attitude to Palestine. I think only then I would hope to enhance a change from within, because there is already a potential for a different point of view within the Jewish society, but I think it needs these other processes to take place before that potential would be fully exhausted and become constructive.
I would just like to re-emphasize Ilan's last point. Changes in the international community, which are what should concern us, because we can do something about it. We can't do much about things happening elsewhere. We can do something about where we are. We can help create changes in the international environment to which Israel will respond in many ways. We can be more supportive of groups moving within Israel. They're marginal, but they're there, moving towards some decent solution. We can stop supporting the most reactionary, harsh, brutal elements. That's what we can do.
Can I actually ask both of you my own question? And that's about something very recent. What do you think the significance is of the conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd? I mean, do you think it can also maybe tell us something about how we should organize our internationalist solidarities as well?
Well, it tells you a lot. You should look at the reactions. On the part of, obviously, Afro-American community, the general political community, and the more or less humane, liberal sector of the population, saying, okay, we finally achieved something, now let's go on to the next. Take a look at the conservative reaction. People like Alan Dershowitz, for example, who you know, column today saying it was an illegitimate judgment. The judge should have called a mistrial because somebody in Black Congresswoman Maxine Waters made a very harsh critical comment saying if the jury doesn't act the right way, we'll carry out violence. Okay, that means it was a mistrial. The jury was intimidated. It doesn't mean anything. You hear the same on Fox News. The real problem is the persecuted whites. The person who's defending us from criminality is charged by an intimidated jury, intimidated by these black left maniacs who are destroying the country. Okay, so it intensifies the incipient civil war that's going on. And it's kind of like a civil war, serious. I presume, I haven't seen reactions from abroad yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're similar.
Yes, Sajjad, I think even before the trial, the ripples of this event reached even the United Kingdom. I think we would not have been talking about Black history in Britain and revisiting the British curricula in high schools about the role of Britain in the slave industry and so on. And surprisingly, without that event, even before it came to the trial. I'm even more optimistic in the sense that taking Black Lives Matters all together and the response to both the murder and the trial, there is a shift in the African American community, and they are much more intersectional in their view of the world. It began in Ferguson, I remember, when they saw the connection between the behavior of the police and the behavior of the Israeli army in the Gaza Strip. And there was a demonstration in the Gaza Strip in support of Ferguson. This kind of intersectionality where the African American community can play a very important role, given the role of the United States, not only in the affairs of Palestine, but in the affairs of the Arab world altogether, and maybe even beyond, I think that this is the real democracy. We are looking for the American spring, not just for the Arab spring. We're looking for that spring where American policy will begin to represent impulses and drives for justice and would change that policy. I think we should wrap up maybe with a short question if there is one, and then we should release Professor Chomsky.
Which Colter is going to ask.
Yeah, the last question is a follow-up to Professor Chomsky's comments on global vaccinations from Ruben Timmerman on Zoom. How do you see Israel's responsibilities with respect to vaccines in Palestine? And how do you respond to the Israeli claim that the Palestinian Authority is responsible for administering that vaccine and that the Palestinian Authority had refused Israeli assistance in doing so?
Well, we should recognize that there are two different opinions about Israel's responsibility in the occupied territories. One is the opinion of every international legal authority of any standing, all the governments in the world saying, including the United States, saying Israel is the occupying power. It has the responsibilities under lots of conventions of being responsible. It has the responsibility to take care of the population under occupation. That's one view. The second view is that of the Israeli government, essentially in isolation, saying, not our responsibility, and we don't occupy it, just a temporary administration. We don't have any responsibility. It's their responsibility. So you can take your choice. Do you want to stand with every legal authority in the entire world, or do you want to stand with the government of Israel? And that's the answer to the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great.
I think, yes, we are. Who's going to make the concluding remarks?
Well, just of course, thank both of you, Professor Chomsky and Professor Pappé. Thank you to all of those who joined us on Zoom and also who've been following the live stream on YouTube. Of course, if you missed it, and if you know anyone who missed it, please do direct them to our YouTube channel, the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies YouTube channel, where this video will remain live. Well, it will remain present there for people to watch later. I guess with that, just thank you to everyone who's joined us. Thank you for the conversation. I hope this will provoke many future conversations, and we'll continue talking about this. And I hope that the very theme of international solidarity is something that we continue to embrace, especially in the time of COVID. It's so important for us to actually work from below to activate this. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening, rest of the day to all of you who've watched. Thank you.
Thank you, Noam, and good luck with the Brazilian crowd. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. Again, sorry for the delay, but we managed to do the hour and a half that we promised everyone we will do. And I just want to add my personal thanks to everyone, and hope to see you all in the next events. We have a conversation with Judith Butler, hopefully at 6 o'clock next Thursday. I hope to see you all then, asking similar questions and extending the debate to issues that Professor Butler has written about and is interested in. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night, good morning, good afternoon, and Ramadan Kareem for those of you who have fasted today, and all the best to everyone.